Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Carrie Oderman with UATV. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed a law introducing amendments to the Criminal Code of Ukraine and the Criminal Procedure Code of Ukraine on reducing pressure on businesses. The document in particular decriminalizes fictitious businesses. To discuss this and more, we welcome to our studio today Yaroslav Gregyalchuk, Deputy Business-Ombudsman in Ukraine. Hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here again, Carrie.
Let's talk about this legislation. Let's start with how it was passed first, because in the last weeks, President Zelensky and his administration have been criticized for passing too much legislation too quickly. What was the turnaround time with this?
Speedy enough to be adopted within perhaps somewhat expedited procedure within the parliament, but for the avoidance of doubt, both of those changes that has been implemented by this law called on alleviating pressure of law enforcement on business has been awaited by the business community for quite a while.
So it's been awaited. What's it making easier for them? What kind of pressures were they suffering from?
Let me start with decriminalization or abolishment of fictitious entrepreneurship. You know, sounds a little bit lengthy, but the scenario typically would be as follows. A director, a financial director, or an accountant of this particular business that has been approached originally by the law enforcers would be forced to sign a plea bargain, effectively an agreement acknowledging that he has committed something criminally prosecuted. It's an agreement on acknowledging guilt.
Okay.
That would be documented through the court ruling. He or she would pay a relatively marginal fine, but the text of the plea bargain agreement would acknowledge that some of the transactions that this particular business entered in with certain third parties have actually never happened in real life, so they are fictitious. And here is the element of pressure kicks in, because these third parties would often be large businesses. Some of them would be very well acknowledged international businesses with the presence in Ukraine. And the existence of such a plea bargain agreement would enable law enforcers to subsequently approach such international and large local companies, arguing that, look, you have committed tax evasion because there is this plea agreement which acknowledges that these transactions that you had with this particular entity have never happened in the real life. And that's why Business-Ombudsman Council has always been in favor of the abolishment of this article in the Criminal Code.
So how will this help foreign investors? You've been registering lots of complaints over the past 4 years. Over 6,000 complaints have gone across your organization's desks. And I'd like to talk about the kind of complaints foreign businesses file. And is there a difference between what the foreign businesses are focusing on and what the Ukrainian businesses are focusing on?
Every 6 complaint lodged with us is whereby it is a foreign business or foreign investor, typically an owner of the Ukrainian entity, in an attempt to challenge the instance of the business malpractice at the part of the Ukrainian authorities. The taxonomy of complaints and the statistical breakdown is more or less the same throughout the entire typology of complainants that we observe. Differences is that while overall some 20% of our complainants are large businesses and the rest 8% is small and medium, and this is just the game of figures. This is certain statistical thing that is obvious. In case of foreign investors, the figures is exactly the other way around. 80% of our foreign investor complainants are large businesses, whereby because of the sheer number of small and medium-sized foreign businesses attempting to act in Ukraine, 20% of the remaining figure.
So what are they complaining about? What are their main problems?
About 50% of the complaints are lodged to challenge different types of malpractices at the part of tax authorities. some 6-8% customs scenarios. We are topping some 17% where the complainants are challenging actions or inactions on the part of the law enforcers of different kinds. Roughly speaking, about 15% are complaints lodged to challenge business malpractices on the part of subnational governments.
Now, you're choosing your words very carefully. Are we talking about corruption here?
We don't know. We are not the authority, we are not the body to answer that question, because we, in a kind of a healthy sense, we are formalistic enough. We are acting pursuant to our rules of the procedure, which says that if this is the inaction, decision at the part of any public authority, ministry, law enforcement agency, state or communal-owned enterprise, you've got to take it on board. And we just don't have this eligibility criteria, whether there are some signs of corruption or not. I can only make an educated guess that ostensibly a portion of the complaints lodged with us should have included this corruption element. But essentially, this is not something that is absolutely obvious in terms of the substance of that stuff that we are dealing with. When we see that this is the actual crime, in terms of those merits that are lodged for our consideration, well, since we are not a law enforcement agency, we don't have any binding authority, in a due course, we would certainly forward those merits to the respective law enforcement agency.
Let's talk about the current political climate in general. When President Zelensky was elected, no one was sure about his political ideology. Comes out that he is kind of a classical liberalist. Now he's deregulating business. Some people think when business is deregulated, it's a sum-null game for the consumer. Now, pressure's being taken off businesses in the Ukraine. Is the consumer going to suffer? Are there structures in Ukraine for the pressure being taken off businesses, but what's picking up the slack for the consumers?
Well, this is a question with a certain political flavor, of course, attached to that. And from the outset, I would have to say that we are not the body, as the Business-Ombudsman Council, who are inherently positioned to comment on the policy choices made by the government, made by the state of Ukraine. But, you know, just a few observations that I can share
Please.
are that there is a certain difference between the attempt to deregulate and an attempt to create the effect of chaos. And obviously there is a need, if there is a certain regulatory loophole, also in the areas where consumers are probably rather suffering than the other way around, some healthy regulation, including the adequate level of enforcement, are absolutely adequate in order for the consumers to actually win. And if Zelensky and the team are genuine in their attempts to affect the structure of Ukrainian economy in various fields, so that the competition would be promoted and encouraged, I cannot say that this would be something that Ukrainian consumers would not benefit from.
We've talked to other business experts, and they talk about how once investors realize that the war in the Donbass and the annexation of Crimea is not an issue for doing business in Kiev, people are keen to come here because it's easy to do business here. Would you agree? And what makes it easier to do business here than in Western Europe?
Interesting question also for someone who sits in a think tank rather than in the organization that monitors not particularly pleasant things that are happening there on the ground. But I can just assume that you know, certain advantages that Ukraine is to take advantage of is geographical position, is of course the affordability of the labor force, the bargaining power of those that are coming with foreign money here, in terms of being able to start up something and proceed with the expansion to Ukraine. Things, of course, that needs to be properly tackled in order to make Ukraine even more attractive in the area of ensuring adherence to the rule of law, functioning of the judiciary, combating corruption, alleviating pressure caused by law enforcers. By the way, pressure on the part of law enforcers is not even the component in the international rankings that attempts to rank countries in terms of the quality of business environment. You will not see it either in the World Bank doing business, nor in the World Economic Forum's competitiveness index. But this is something really obvious, really over there on the ground. And attempts are being made to make things better, both in terms of the quality of legislation, something that we have started from, and those institutional reforms that are being made or are contemplated in the law enforcement sphere, like the dissolution of the Department of Economic Crimes that used to exist under the auspices of the National Police, or the reform of the of the investigatory jurisdiction currently possessed by the State Security Service, or the ongoing reform of the Prosecutor's Office. And most importantly, when it comes to the interest of business, is the idea to create a single law enforcement agency that would be tasked to investigate all fiscal, economic crimes, tentatively called by the Bureau of Financial Investigations, which would be reporting to the Ministry of Finance.
You beat me to my next question. I was going to ask you about which policy changes or which bills you suggest, and that basically summarizes it.
Yes.
Some legal reform, and what were the other two things you mentioned?
I mentioned that essentially if we want to tackle that area, you got to change two things. The quality of legal rules, both material and procedural, both criminal code and criminal procedural code. And on top of that, the institutional reform. How does this array of bodies that comprise Ukrainian law enforcement sphere operate, how they exist, who is responsible for what, and who is, most importantly, no longer responsible for what. Because for certain types of crimes, like the Article 212, tax evasion, something that we have started from, there was a situation when a few law enforcement agencies might have been entitled to effectively investigate the same merits simultaneously. Or one would stop and another would start. That has to stop.
Let's talk about tax evasion. You and I had spoken about that before the interview began, because it's an interesting point. The bar has been raised for how much tax you're allowed to evade before you get in trouble. I know I'm not saying that
There
right.
are a few nuances to this situation, but one of them is the provision of the law that we have mentioned from the outset, which basically said that you cannot, the law enforcement are not entitled to lodge criminal proceeding on allegations of tax evasion unless the amount is almost 3 million hryvnias. To be specific, 2,800,000. It used to be 3 times less. And we certainly welcome that because, ostensibly that should diminish appetite at the part of the tax police to launch those criminal investigations. But there is still some things that needs to be done, and they are even more material than what has already been done. Right now we have a situation in Ukraine whereby the sheer existence of a tax dispute equals to the opportunity, the right for the law enforcers to launch criminal proceedings. But you cannot criminalize the ongoing administrative litigation. In other words, what we are saying, and what even Supreme Court said the other day, but it's not duly enforced in practice, is that, okay, you are entitled, of course, to launch and investigate those allegations based on the tax evasion, provided that there is a court decision, typically the decision of the administrative court, which would acknowledge that, yes, this particular taxpayer is acknowledged as the one that owes a certain amount to the budget. Unless this fact is proved and evidenced by the court decision that entered into force, we don't see any grounds for even launching those type of criminal proceedings.
So if I understand you correctly, there's a possibility right now in Ukraine to launch frivolous lawsuits against a competitor to help your business, and you're working against that?
We are working against frivolous criminal investigations launched by law enforcers, by tax police, against those taxpayers that have not even been found as owing anything to the budget.
That's all the time we have to talk today. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That was Yaroslav Gregorchuk, Deputy Business Ombudsman in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more with UATV.